emergency?
We need him. Police.
What's going on?
515th Street.
What's going on there, ma'am?
We have a kidnapping. Hurry, please.
Explain to me what's going on, okay?
There's a note left and our daughter's gone.
A note was left and your daughter is
Yes.
gone? How old is your daughter?
6 years old. She's blonde. 6 years old.
How long ago was this?
I don't know. I just found the note. And my daughter's
Does it say who took her?
What?
Does it say who took her?
I don't know. There's a ransom note here.
It's a ransom note?
It says FBTC. Victory. Please.
Okay, what's your name? Are you
Kathy Ramsey. I'm the mother. Oh my God. Please.
I'm sending an officer over, okay?
Please.
Do you know how long she's been gone?
No, I don't. Please, we just got out. Is she right here? Oh my God, please.
Okay, well,
There's somebody.
I am, honey.
Please.
Take a deep breath,
Please,
okay?
hurry.
Kathy?
Most people believe they understand the JonBenét Ramsey case. They believe they know what happened, who was responsible, and why the case ended the way it did. Over the years, this story has been told so many times, retold in so many documentaries, analyzed in so many books, dissected in so many podcasts, that it now feels finished, almost settled in the public mind. The narrative has achieved a kind of cultural permanence, like a museum exhibit behind glass, something to observe but not to question. But the problem is that this sense of certainty was built very early on, before the facts were fully understood, before the investigation had run its course, before alternative explanations were seriously explored, and once that version of events took hold, everything else was forced to fit inside it. Every new piece of evidence was interpreted through that initial lens. Every witness statement was filtered through that original narrative. Every theory was measured against that first impression. What if the real story of JonBenét Ramsey isn't primarily about who killed her, but about how an entire nation was slowly guided toward a conclusion that may not have deserved that level of confidence? What if the true mystery isn't the crime itself, but the process by which millions of people came to believe they understood it? Because when you strip away the headlines, the documentaries, the made-for-TV movies, the tabloid covers, and the repeated talking points that have been recycled for nearly 3 decades, something uncomfortable becomes clear. This case wasn't just unsolved. It was misunderstood from the very beginning. And that misunderstanding wasn't an accident. It was the result of specific choices made by media outlets, by investigators under pressure, by a public hungry for closure, and by a cultural moment that demanded simple answers to complex questions. In the days after JonBenét was found dead in her family's home on December 26, 1996, the public didn't just want answers. It wanted closure. And closure requires a story that feels emotionally complete. A story with clear roles, clear motives, clear villains, and clear victims. The media responded to that demand almost immediately, not through conspiracy or malice, but through the simple economics of attention. Certain details were highlighted again and again, repeated in every newscast, printed in every newspaper, discussed on every talk show, while others quietly faded into the background, mentioned once or twice and then forgotten. Over time, the repetition of those details created familiarity, and familiarity created the illusion of understanding, and that illusion hardened into belief. By the time most Americans felt they had heard enough about the case to form an opinion, they had actually only heard a very specific subset of information presented in a very specific way, designed to tell a very specific story. One of the most powerful forces in this case wasn't evidence. It wasn't forensic science. It wasn't eyewitness testimony. It was narrative momentum. Once the idea took hold that the truth must be found inside the house, and more specifically inside the family, every new piece of information was interpreted through that lens. Every action by JonBenét's parents was viewed with suspicion. Every inconsistency in their statements was treated as potentially incriminating. Every decision they made about lawyers, about media appearances, about cooperation with investigators, was analyzed not as the behavior of grieving parents in an impossible situation, but as the behavior of people with something to hide. Innocent details began to feel suspicious. Ambiguities were treated as signs of guilt. And inconsistencies, which are common in traumatic situations, which are in fact the norm when people are in shock, exhausted, and terrified, were reframed as proof of deception. The public was rarely asked to slow down and examine how quickly these assumptions formed. Instead, viewers were encouraged to ask the same question over and over again, in slightly different variations, but always with the same underlying assumption. Which member of the family did it? Was it the father? Was it the mother? Was it the brother? That framing alone eliminated entire categories of possibilities before they were seriously explored. It closed doors that should have remained open. It narrowed the investigation in the public mind even as law enforcement was still gathering evidence. When a case begins with a narrowed field of acceptable answers, when the parameters of what is considered plausible are established not by evidence, but by narrative convenience, the outcome is often predetermined long before the investigation is complete. Another issue that fundamentally shaped public perception was the way certainty was presented by media outlets. Many reports spoke with confidence, even when the underlying facts were complex, contradictory, or unresolved. Language matters. The words we choose to describe events shape how those events are understood. Saying something raised questions is very different from saying it proved suspicion. Saying behavior was unusual is different from saying behavior was incriminating. But over time, cautious language was replaced with implication. An implication slowly hardened into accusation. An accusation was repeated so often that it began to sound like established fact. Viewers didn't realize that they were absorbing opinion dressed up as fact. They didn't notice the shift from reporting what was known to speculating about what might be true. They didn't recognize the difference between evidence and interpretation. And because the interpretations were presented with such confidence by authoritative voices in professional settings, they were accepted as truth. The ransom note became a centerpiece of this narrative, perhaps the single most analyzed piece of evidence in the entire case. It was treated less as a piece of evidence and more as a psychological fingerprint, a shortcut to motive and identity, a window into the mind of whoever wrote it. Endless attention was paid to how it was written, how long it was, what kind of paper it was written on, what kind of pen was used, what phrases it contained, what movies those phrases might have come from, and what all of this supposedly revealed about the person who wrote it. Handwriting analysts were brought in. Linguistic experts weighed in. Psychologists offered profiles. But far less attention was given to how interpretation of the note changed depending on what the observer already believed. Those who believed the crime was internal, that someone in the house was responsible, saw manipulation and staging. They saw a ransom note that was too long, too detailed, too theatrical to be real. They saw it as a poorly executed attempt to create a false narrative. Those who didn't start with that assumption, who remained open to the possibility of an intruder, saw something else entirely. They saw evidence of an unstable individual, someone who might have written a rambling note because they were panicked or delusional, or following some internal logic that made sense to them but to no one else. The note didn't speak with one voice. People projected their assumptions onto it. And because it was ambiguous enough to support multiple interpretations, it became a Rorschach test, revealing more about the observer than about the author. Behavior also became a major factor in shaping public opinion, perhaps even more than physical evidence. The actions of JonBenét's parents were analyzed in extreme detail, often without context, often without an understanding of trauma psychology, often without acknowledging that there is no normal way to behave when your child has been murdered. Reactions during moments of shock and grief were compared to an imagined standard of how people are supposed to behave in crisis. When those reactions didn't match expectations, when John Ramsey seemed too controlled, or Patsy Ramsey seemed too emotional, or their responses seemed inconsistent from one moment to the next, suspicion filled the gap. But human behavior under extreme stress is unpredictable. There is no universal script for grief, panic, or fear. Some people shut down. Some people become hyper-focused on details. Some people seem detached. Some people oscillate between all of these states within minutes. Treating deviation from expectation as evidence of guilt was a leap that many accepted without realizing it. They absorbed the idea that innocent people behave one way and guilty people behave another, when in reality, behavior in the aftermath of trauma is one of the least reliable indicators of anything. As the media coverage intensified in the weeks and months following JonBenét's death, the pressure to maintain a compelling story increased. News is a business, attention is a commodity, and in that environment, subtlety doesn't hold attention. Ambiguity doesn't create strong ratings. Nuance doesn't generate clicks. What does is conflict, accusation, certainty, and the promise of resolution. And so the same ideas were recycled again and again, each time sounding more authoritative simply because they had been repeated. The story became familiar, and familiarity was mistaken for truth. The more people heard the same details, the same theories, the same implications, the more convinced they became that they understood the case. They didn't realize that understanding had been replaced by recognition. They knew the story, but they didn't necessarily know the truth. Over time, documentaries and retrospectives didn't challenge this framework. They reinforced it. Many presented themselves as neutral examinations, as fresh looks at the evidence, as attempts to cut through the noise and get to the facts. But they often started from the same assumptions established decades earlier. They asked the same questions. They highlighted the same details. They interviewed the same experts who had already made their positions clear. This created the illusion of independent confirmation. In reality, it was the same narrative echoing back at the audience from different directions. When multiple sources repeat the same interpretation, it feels like corroboration, even when those sources are all drawing from the same well of information, filtered through the same biases, shaped by the same cultural moment. What's rarely discussed is how difficult it is to correct a story once it becomes culturally fixed. New information doesn't arrive in a vacuum. It has to compete with years of emotional investment, with established beliefs, with the psychological comfort of thinking you already know the answer. Admitting that the public may have been wrong, that the story we've been told for decades might be incomplete or misleading, doesn't just challenge facts. It challenges identity, judgment, and trust in the systems that presented the story in the first place. It forces people to confront the uncomfortable possibility that they were manipulated, or at minimum, that they accepted conclusions without sufficient evidence. And that's a difficult thing to admit, especially when the story has been internalized for so long that it feels like personal knowledge rather than inherited narrative. This is why the JonBenét Ramsey case still feels unresolved, not just legally, but psychologically. People sense that something doesn't quite fit, yet they struggle to articulate why. The discomfort doesn't come from a lack of theories. There are plenty of theories. The discomfort comes from the realization that the foundation of what we think we know may be unstable, that the story we've accepted may have been built on selective attention, on emotional reasoning, on the need for closure rather than the pursuit of truth. And once that realization begins to surface, even if only subconsciously, it creates a lingering unease that no amount of repetition can fully resolve. The most unsettling possibility isn't that the wrong person was accused, or that the right person was never found, though both of those possibilities remain very real. The most unsettling possibility is that the rush to create a satisfying story may have prevented a fuller understanding from ever developing. When certainty arrives too early, when the public decides it knows the answer before the investigation is complete, curiosity disappears. And without curiosity, critical questions go unasked. Alternative theories are dismissed without serious consideration. Evidence that doesn't fit the narrative is ignored or explained away. Witnesses who contradict the established story are marginalized, and the case becomes frozen in time, locked into a version of events that may or may not reflect what actually happened. So maybe the most important question isn't who committed the crime. Maybe it's why so many people became so confident in a version of events built on selective attention, emotional momentum, and repeated suggestion. Maybe it's why the media was so quick to construct a narrative before the facts were fully known. Maybe it's why the public was so willing to accept that narrative without demanding more evidence, more context, more time. Maybe it's why the systems designed to seek truth, the media, the legal system, the investigative process, all seem to prioritize closure over accuracy. Because if this case teaches us anything, it's that being told a story enough times can feel indistinguishable from discovering the truth yourself. Repetition creates the illusion of knowledge. Familiarity creates the illusion of understanding. And once that illusion is in place, it becomes very difficult to see past it. And that leaves us with something far more unsettling than an unsolved mystery. It leaves us with the possibility that the real failure of the JonBenét Ramsey case wasn't evidence or even investigation, but the moment when the world decided it already understood what had happened and stopped looking any deeper. The moment when curiosity was replaced by certainty. The moment when questions were replaced by answers that felt good enough. The moment when the story became more important than the truth. Because once that moment passes, once the public believes it knows the answer, it becomes nearly impossible to go back and start over. The narrative has been set. The roles have been cast. The conclusion has been written. And anything that contradicts that conclusion is met with resistance, Not because it's necessarily wrong, but because it threatens the comfort of thinking we already know. This dynamic isn't unique to the JonBenét Ramsey case. It happens in many high-profile investigations. It happens in political scandals. It happens in historical events. Whenever there is intense public interest, whenever there is pressure for quick answers, whenever there is a media ecosystem that rewards certainty over nuance, the same pattern emerges. A narrative forms quickly, it gets repeated, it becomes familiar, it becomes accepted, and then it becomes very difficult to dislodge, even in the face of contradictory evidence. The story takes on a life of its own, independent of the facts. And once that happens, the story can survive even when the facts change. What makes the JonBenét case particularly instructive is how transparently this process played out. We can see the moment when the media seized on certain details and ignored others. We can see the moment when suspicion hardened into accusation. We can see the moment when alternative theories were dismissed, not because they lacked merit, but because they didn't fit the story the public wanted to hear. We can see all of this happening in real time, preserved in news archives, in documentaries, in books, in the cultural memory of the case. And yet, despite all of this being visible, despite all of this being documented, the original narrative persists, because changing a story requires more than new information. It requires a willingness to question what we thought we knew, and that willingness is rare. The question then becomes not just what happened to JonBenét Ramsey, but what happened to the way we process information about cases like this? What happened to the distinction between evidence and speculation? What happened to the principle of presumption of innocence? What happened to the idea that complex questions deserve complex answers? What happened to the patience required to let investigations unfold before rushing to judgment? All of these principles, which are supposed to be foundational to how we think about crime and justice, seem to evaporate in the face of public pressure for a simple, satisfying story. And that should concern us, not just because it affected this case, but because it affects how we think about every case. It affects how we consume news. It affects how we form beliefs. It affects how we distinguish between what we know and what we think we know. The legacy of the JonBenét Ramsey case isn't just an unsolved murder. It's a case study in how narratives form, how they spread, how they become resistant to correction, and how they shape public consciousness in ways that outlast the evidence. It's a reminder that the stories we tell ourselves about events are not neutral. They are constructed. They reflect choices about what to emphasize and what to ignore. They reflect assumptions about what is plausible and what is not. They reflect cultural anxieties, media incentives, and the very human desire for closure. And once those stories are constructed, they become difficult to deconstruct, even when there are good reasons to do so. So when we talk about the JonBenét Ramsey case today, nearly 30 years after her death, we're not just talking about a cold case. We're talking about the power of narrative to override evidence. We're talking about the difficulty of correcting a story once it's been widely accepted. We're talking about the way media coverage can shape public perception in ways that persist long after the coverage itself has faded. And we're talking about the uncomfortable possibility that the version of events we've been told, the version we've accepted, the version we think we understand, may be less about what actually happened and more about what we needed to believe. And that's the real question that lingers. Not who killed JonBenét Ramsey, though that question remains important and deserves an answer. But why did the world become so certain so quickly? Why did doubt give way to confidence before the evidence warranted it? Why did speculation become treated as fact? Why did the story matter more than the truth? These are the questions that make this case unsettling in a way that goes beyond the tragedy of a child's death. These are the questions that force us to confront how we form beliefs, how we evaluate evidence, how we decide what to trust. And these are the questions that, if we're honest, we still don't have good answers to. Because the JonBenét Ramsey case isn't over. It's still being investigated. New technologies continue to be applied to old evidence. New witnesses continue to come forward. New theories continue to be proposed. But none of that will matter if the public has already made up its mind. None of that will matter if the narrative is too deeply entrenched to be challenged. None of that will matter if we've convinced ourselves that we already know the answer and we're just waiting for confirmation of what we've always believed. And that's the real tragedy. Not that the case is unsolved, but that the way we think about it may prevent it from ever being truly solved. Because we stopped being curious, we stopped asking questions, we stopped looking deeper. We decided we already understood. And once that decision is made, truth becomes secondary to the comfort of certainty. To understand how deeply this narrative became embedded, Consider the role that class played in shaping perception. The Ramseys were wealthy. They lived in a large house in an affluent neighborhood. Patsy Ramsey had been a beauty queen. JonBenét herself competed in child beauty pageants, an activity that many found unsettling. This combination of wealth, pageantry, and a crime committed inside what should have been a safe, privileged space created a perfect storm of cultural resentment. The media didn't just report on the case, it moralized about it. The pageants were presented as evidence of something fundamentally wrong with the family. The wealth was treated as a kind of original sin, a marker that these were people who believed themselves above scrutiny. And when tragedy struck, that resentment found an outlet. The narrative became not just about solving a crime, but about exposing the rot beneath the surface of upper-class respectability. This class dimension is rarely discussed explicitly, but it permeates the coverage. Watch early news reports and you'll notice the tone. There's an implicit suggestion that the Ramseys brought this on themselves, not through any specific action, but through their lifestyle, their choices, their presentation of their daughter. The pageants became symbolic of parental exploitation. The large house became a labyrinth of secrets. The wealth became insulation from accountability. None of these things are evidence of guilt, but they created an emotional framework that made guilt feel plausible. The public was primed to believe that people like the Ramseys were capable of terrible things, not because of what they did, but because of who they were. This is where the case intersects with broader cultural anxieties. In the mid-1990s, America was grappling with questions about childhood, innocence, and the sexualization of young girls. JonBenét's pageant photos, with their heavy makeup and adult-styled costumes, became flashpoints in that conversation. People saw those images and felt uncomfortable, and that discomfort needed an explanation. The easiest explanation was that the parents were exploiting their daughter, and from there, it was a short leap to the idea that they might be capable of worse. The pageants became not just a detail of the case, but a kind of moral evidence, proof that something was wrong in that household even before the crime occurred. But this focus on the pageants obscured other possibilities. It created a narrative in which the crime had to be connected to the pageants, to the family's public presentation, to their wealth and status. It made an intruder theory seem less plausible, not because the evidence ruled it out, but because it didn't fit the emotional logic of the story. If the crime was about exposing the dark side of privilege, then it had to come from inside that world. An intruder, a random predator, didn't serve the same narrative function. It didn't satisfy the same cultural needs. And so, evidence that pointed toward an intruder was minimized, explained away, or ignored entirely. Consider the physical evidence that didn't fit the family theory. DNA found on JonBenét's clothing that didn't match any family member. An unidentified palm print on the door to the wine cellar where her body was found. A boot print near the body that didn't match any shoes in the house. A basement window that appeared to have been used for entry. Reports of a strange man seen near the house in the days before the murder. None of these details received the same level of attention as the ransom note or the parents' behavior. Why? Because they complicated the story. They introduced ambiguity where the public wanted certainty. They suggested that the truth might be messier, less emotionally satisfying than the narrative that had already taken hold. The DNA evidence is particularly telling. For years, it was downplayed or dismissed as contamination, as transfer from manufacturing, as anything other than what it might actually be, evidence of an intruder. But in recent years, as DNA technology has advanced, that evidence has become harder to ignore. Genealogical DNA techniques that have solved other cold cases could potentially identify the source of that DNA. But even now, decades later, there's resistance to fully embracing this possibility. The narrative is too entrenched. Admitting that the DNA might point to an intruder means admitting that the family theory, the theory that dominated coverage for decades, might have been wrong, and that's a difficult thing for a society to accept. This resistance reveals something important about how we process information. We don't evaluate evidence neutrally. We evaluate it through the lens of what we already believe. When evidence confirms our beliefs, we accept it readily. When it challenges our beliefs, we scrutinize it more carefully, looking for reasons to dismiss it. This is called confirmation bias, and it's one of the most powerful forces in human psychology. In the JonBenét case, confirmation bias worked in favor of the family theory because that was the theory that formed first, that was repeated most often, that felt most emotionally satisfying. Evidence that supported it was amplified. Evidence that contradicted it was minimized. And over time, This created a feedback loop that made the theory seem more credible than it actually was. The media's role in this process cannot be overstated. In the weeks and months after JonBenét's death, coverage was relentless. The case was on the front page of newspapers, the lead story on evening news broadcasts, the subject of endless cable news segments, and much of that coverage was speculative. Experts were brought in to analyze the ransom note, to profile the killer, to interpret the parents' behavior. But these weren't neutral analyses. They were performances designed to create compelling television, to generate ratings, to keep viewers engaged. The experts knew what the audience wanted to hear. They knew which theories would generate the most discussion, and they delivered accordingly. This created a situation where speculation became self-reinforcing. One expert would suggest that the ransom note showed signs of staging. Another expert, appearing on a different show, would cite that first expert's opinion as if it were established fact. A third expert would build on both, adding additional layers of interpretation. None of this was necessarily based on rigorous analysis. Much of it was educated guessing, informed by experience but ultimately subjective. But when it was presented with confidence, when it was repeated across multiple platforms, when it was delivered by people with credentials and authority, it took on the weight of truth. Viewers didn't realize they were watching a process of narrative construction. They thought they were learning facts. The role of the tabloid media was even more problematic. Tabloids didn't just report on the case, they actively shaped it. They paid sources for information. They published leaked details from the investigation. They ran sensational headlines that implied guilt without stating it directly. And they created a market for content about the case, which in turn incentivized more coverage, more speculation, more invasion into the family's privacy. The Ramseys were photographed constantly. Their movements were tracked. Their friends and neighbors were interviewed. Every aspect of their lives was subjected to public scrutiny. This created an environment in which they were presumed guilty simply by virtue of being the focus of so much attention. Innocence became almost impossible to prove in the court of public opinion. What's particularly insidious about this process is that it operates below the level of conscious awareness. Most people don't realize they're being influenced. They don't see the machinery of narrative construction at work. They experience the end result, a coherent story that feels true, and they accept it without questioning where it came from or how it was assembled. This is the power of media in the modern age. It doesn't just report reality, it shapes our perception of reality. And once that perception is shaped, it's very difficult to reshape it, even when new information suggests we should. The investigative process itself was also shaped by these narrative pressures. The Boulder Police Department, which handled the initial investigation, was a small-town force unaccustomed to cases of this magnitude. They were immediately overwhelmed, not just by the complexity of the case, but by the media attention surrounding it. Every decision they made was scrutinized. Every misstep was magnified. And the pressure to produce results, to give the public the closure it demanded, was immense. This pressure can affect how investigations are conducted. It can lead to tunnel vision, where investigators focus on the most obvious suspects and ignore alternatives. It can lead to confirmation bias, where evidence is interpreted in ways that support the prevailing theory. And it can lead to mistakes, procedural errors that compromise the integrity of the case. In the JonBenét case, there were significant missteps in the early hours of the investigation. The crime scene was not properly secured. Family members and friends were allowed to move through the house. The body was moved before it could be fully documented in its original location. These errors didn't necessarily point to any particular conclusion about guilt or innocence, but they did compromise the investigation. They created ambiguities that would never be fully resolved, and in a case this complex, where every detail mattered, those ambiguities left room for endless speculation and debate. The relationship between the police and the Ramseys also became contentious early on. The Ramseys hired lawyers almost immediately, which is their legal right, but which many interpreted as a sign of guilt. They were reluctant to submit to extensive interrogations, which again is their right, but which was seen as uncooperative. This created a standoff that lasted for years, with the police convinced the family was hiding something, and the family convinced they were being unfairly targeted. This adversarial dynamic made it harder to solve the case. Instead of working together toward a common goal, the two sides became locked in a struggle over narrative control. The police leaked information to the press to apply pressure. The Ramseys gave carefully controlled interviews to defend themselves. And the truth, whatever it was, became secondary to the battle over perception. This brings us to another uncomfortable question. What if the focus on the family wasn't just a result of evidence, but of investigative convenience? It's easier to investigate people you have access to, people who are local, people whose lives you can examine in detail. It's much harder to investigate an unknown intruder, someone who might have left few traces, who might have been passing through, who might never be identified. The family theory was, in some ways, the path of least resistance. It allowed the investigation to move forward with concrete subjects to examine. It gave the media a compelling story. It gave the public someone to focus their anger and fear on. An intruder theory, by contrast, would have meant accepting that a child could be murdered in her own home by someone random, someone unknowable, someone who might strike again. That's a much more frightening possibility. And psychologically, we resist frightening possibilities that offer no sense of control or resolution. This is part of why cases involving strangers often go unsolved, while cases involving people known to the victim are more likely to be closed. It's not necessarily because the stranger cases are harder to solve in an absolute sense. It's because they require different investigative approaches, more resources, more patience, and a willingness to accept uncertainty. They don't offer the narrative satisfaction of identifying a specific person, understanding their motive, and bringing them to justice. And in a media-saturated environment, where cases are covered in real time and the public demands constant updates, that kind of uncertainty is hard to sustain. Another factor that shaped this case was gender. Patsy Ramsey, as the mother, was subjected to a particular kind of scrutiny. Mothers who deviate from expected norms of maternal behavior are often viewed with suspicion. Patsy was glamorous, ambitious, involved in pageantry, all things that didn't fit the stereotype of a nurturing, self-sacrificing mother. When tragedy struck, those qualities were reinterpreted as evidence of character flaws, as signs that she was capable of terrible things. This gendered dimension of the coverage is rarely acknowledged, but it's visible in the way Patsy was discussed versus how John was discussed. She was emotional, hysterical, performative. He was cold, calculating, suspicious in his composure. Both were criticized, but the nature of the criticism reflected deep-seated ideas about how men and women are supposed to behave, particularly in crisis. There's also the question of how the case would be handled today, with modern forensic technology and different media dynamics. DNA analysis has advanced dramatically since 1996. Genealogical databases that didn't exist then could now potentially identify unknown individuals from DNA samples. Digital forensics could analyze communications in ways that weren't possible before. But at the same time, the media landscape has changed in ways that might make a case like this even more difficult. Social media would amplify speculation instantly. Conspiracy theories would spread faster. The family would be subjected to even more intense scrutiny and harassment. The pressure for quick conclusions would be even greater. In some ways, we've learned from cases like JonBenét. In other ways, the problems that plagued this investigation have only intensified. The question of what justice looks like in a case like this is also complicated. If the case is solved tomorrow, if DNA identifies a suspect who is arrested and convicted, does that resolve the damage done by decades of speculation? Does it restore the reputations that were destroyed? Does it undo the trauma inflicted on a family that lost a child and then was accused of her murder in the court of public opinion? These questions don't have easy answers. Justice in the legal sense, a conviction, doesn't necessarily equate to justice in the broader sense, repairing the harm caused by how the case was handled. And what if the case is never solved? What if the truth remains unknowable? That's a possibility we have to accept. Not every case has a resolution. Not every question has an answer. But our culture struggles with that uncertainty. We want narratives with clear endings. We want someone to blame. We want to believe that justice is always possible if we just try hard enough. And when cases remain unsolved, we often construct narratives anyway, choosing the most plausible theory and treating it as fact, because the alternative, accepting that we don't know, is too uncomfortable. This is the deeper lesson of the JonBenét Ramsey case. It's not just about a murdered child, though that tragedy is at its heart. It's about how we construct truth in the absence of certainty. It's about how media shapes perception. It's about how narrative momentum can override evidence. It's about how confirmation bias leads us to see what we expect to see. It's about how class, gender, and cultural anxieties influence what we find believable. It's about how the desire for closure can prevent us from seeing complexity. And it's about how, once a story takes hold, it becomes almost impossible to dislodge, even when new information suggests we should. So when we look back at this case nearly 30 years later, we should ask ourselves not just who killed JonBenét Ramsey, but what we learned about ourselves in the process of trying to answer that question. We should examine how we formed our beliefs. We should question whether those beliefs were based on evidence or on repeated exposure to a particular narrative. We should acknowledge the possibility that we were wrong, or at minimum, that we were more certain than the facts warranted. And we should recognize that the systems we rely on to inform us, the media, the investigative process, the public discourse, are all fallible, all subject to biases, all capable of leading us astray. Because if there's one thing this case proves, it's that being confident and being correct are not the same thing. The public was confident very early on. That confidence never wavered, even as details emerged that complicated the narrative. And that confidence may have been the biggest obstacle to truth. Not malice, not incompetence, just certainty arriving too soon and refusing to leave.